That evening turned my world upside down in ways I could never have foreseen. It began with a seemingly innocent request from my stepmother Jessica, asking me to stay home while my dad went on his usual fishing trip. At the time, it felt routine. After all, it was typically just the two of us on weekends. I had no idea that night would lead to something far from ordinary, testing the boundaries of our relationship and leaving an unforgettable impact on me. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so I can keep sharing more captivating true stories like this one. The house felt strangely quiet that morning with my dad gone, and the silence seemed almost unsettling. I had just finished my schoolwork and was about to relax when Jessica called me into the living room. "Can you give me a hand with something?" she asked, her tone light but strangely hesitant. Her voice carried a nervousness I couldn't quite place. I paused briefly before responding, "Sure, what do you need?" and walked toward where she was seated. Jessica usually had a composed demeanor, but something felt off that day. She smiled, but her gaze held an intensity that quickened my pulse. "Come sit here," she said, patting the cushion beside her. I complied, unsure of what to expect, but intrigued by the situation. Jessica leaned back, crossing her legs and fixing her gaze on me with an expression I'd never seen before. "You've grown up so much," she remarked, her voice light but her words heavy with unspoken meaning. "You're not the little boy I used to know." My heart skipped a beat. This was uncharacteristic of her. Our relationship had always been easygoing, but this felt charged with something unfamiliar, even risky. "I guess," I mumbled, uncertain how to respond. She leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. "No, really," she insisted. "You've changed, and I think we both know it." Her words sent a chill down my spine, filling the air with a tension I didn't know how to diffuse. "Jessica, what are you trying to say?" I finally asked, pushing out the question I needed answered. The silence stretched as she stared at me, searching for the right words. Finally, she sighed and moved to the window, gazing into the yard. "Your dad's gone for the weekend," she said quietly. "It's just us here." I nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading, but feeling a growing unease. She turned back to me, her face unreadable. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice steady but soft. "There are things I've wanted to discuss, things I've never had the courage to say until now." I swallowed hard. "Like what?" I asked. She stepped closer, locking her eyes onto mine. "About us," she said, the single word hanging in the air, making my heart race. Her implication was clear, though I wished it wasn't. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice wavered. "What do you mean, us?" Jessica smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my stomach churn. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" she asked in a low voice. "The way things have shifted between us. We're not just stepmother and stepson anymore." My head spun as I tried to process her words. Deep down, I knew what she meant. The lingering looks, the subtle gestures. But I had always dismissed them as nothing. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my voice barely audible. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, making the room feel oppressively small. "Yes, you do," she whispered, her fingers lightly brushing my arm. I stood abruptly, needing space to think clearly. "Jessica, this is insane," I stammered, my voice shaking. "You're my stepmom. This isn't right." But she didn't back away, closing the gap between us again. "Why not?" she whispered, her eyes alight with intensity. "We're both adults. We don't have to follow anyone else's rules." I shook my head, fighting the pull I felt toward her. "No, this is wrong," I insisted, even as my resolve wavered. "But what if it isn't?" she countered, reaching out to touch my face. Her hand on my cheek sent a jolt through me, leaving me frozen, trapped in the tension she had created. I wanted to say no, to push her away, to escape the room and pretend this never happened, but I couldn't. Something held me there, and I loathed myself for it. The weight of unspoken words and unresolved emotions grew unbearable. Every interaction with Jessica felt charged, like walking on a knife's edge. I avoided being alone with her as much as I could, but it wasn't enough. She always found ways to be near, whether it was a casual touch on the arm or a lingering glance from across the room. The tension was inescapable, simmering constantly between us. Then came the night that changed everything. My dad was working late, and I had confined myself to my room, hoping that keeping my distance would restore normalcy. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I could hear Jessica moving around downstairs, the muffled sound of the TV in the background. The ticking of my clock seemed deafening, each second dragging on as if mocking me. I thought about calling a friend to create an excuse to leave, but something stopped me. Instead, I found myself standing outside my room, listening to the unnerving stillness of the house. It was too quiet, too oppressive, and that's when I made the decision that would alter everything. I descended the stairs, each step feeling more burdensome than the last. Jessica sat on the couch, a wineglass in her hand, her eyes fixed on the television with a distant expression. At first, she seemed unaware of my presence. Or perhaps she noticed but chose to ignore me. I paused at the bottom step, unsure of what to say or do, until her eyes finally met mine. At that moment, I realized there was no escaping what lay ahead. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly, her tone almost too casual. Something in the way she said it made my heart race, reminiscent of the feelings I'd had that first day. "Yeah," I mumbled, unable to trust my voice to say more. I moved to the couch and sat down, ensuring there was as much space as possible between us. Even so, the unspoken tension was palpable, filling the room like a heavy fog. We sat silently for a while, the only sound being the low hum of the TV. I felt her gaze lingering on me, making my skin prickle under its intensity. I didn't know how to break the silence without worsening the situation, but before I could attempt to speak, she broke the quiet herself. "I've been thinking about us," she murmured, her voice just above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "Jessica, we can't," I began, but she interrupted me. "Why not?" she asked, turning to face me fully. "Why are we pretending there's nothing between us when we both know there is?" Her words hit me like a blow. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was mistaken, that this was a path we couldn't take. But deep down, I lacked the strength to fight it anymore. I had felt it too, that strange magnetic pull growing stronger with time. I'd tried to dismiss it, to convince myself it wasn't real. But now, sitting here with her, denial was no longer an option. "We can't do this," I said, though my words lacked conviction. Even as I spoke, I knew they were lies. She leaned in, placing her hand on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her tone low and persuasive. "We're not hurting anyone." I shook my head, desperate to clear the haze clouding my thoughts. "But it's not right," I argued weakly. Her hand reached out to rest on mine, sending a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Who decides what's right and wrong?" she asked, her eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I wanted to pull my hand away, to tell her to stop, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the weight of emotions I had suppressed for so long. "We don't have to follow anyone else's rules," she whispered, tracing soft patterns on the back of my hand. "We can make our own choices." I closed my eyes, trying to block out her voice and the sensation of her touch. But it was no use. The barriers I'd built around myself were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. Before I could gather the strength to pull away, she leaned in, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Tell me you don't feel it too." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much my body responded to her. I opened my mouth to protest, to say this was wrong, that it couldn't happen. But no words came. Instead, I turned to face her, my breath catching as our eyes locked. The moment stretched, the tension between us growing unbearable. Without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and kissed her. At first, the kiss was hesitant, cautious, as though we were both testing the waters. But it quickly deepened, the intensity between us surging like a wave. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer while her fingers wove through my hair. Everything else faded away until it was just the two of us, lost in the heat of the moment. I knew it was wrong. Knew we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But I couldn't stop, and I didn't want to. As the kiss deepened, my mind raced with conflicting thoughts. This was dangerous, a risk too great to take, but a part of me didn't care. A part of me had wanted this far longer than I was willing to admit. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our faces inches from each other. Her eyes, dark and filled with emotion I couldn't name, held mine. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. "And I know you have too." I couldn't respond. The truth was too overwhelming, too much to confront. Instead, I nodded, my heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened settled over me. I knew this was only the beginning, that there was more to come. There always would be. From that night onward, everything between us shifted. I couldn't look at Jessica the same way. Every glance, every brush of her hand brought back the memory of what we'd done, a reminder of the unspoken promise of what might come next. The air in the house was charged, heavy with an unacknowledged tension. Days passed in a haze of awkward silence. I tried to keep my distance, but avoiding her completely was impossible. Every fleeting touch, every look she gave me, felt like a spark ready to ignite something we couldn't control. One afternoon, with my dad out again, the quiet in the house felt suffocating. I paced the living room, trying to distract myself with the TV, but my thoughts kept drifting to her. The memory of that kiss, the way her lips had felt, the way my heart had raced. I hated myself for dwelling on it, but I couldn't stop. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, I heard the sound of her footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw Jessica standing in the doorway, her expression impossible to read. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us was thick, weighted by everything we hadn't voiced. "We need to talk," she finally said, her tone quiet and hesitant. I gave a small nod, understanding this discussion was unavoidable, even if I wasn't ready for it. "Yeah," I replied, my throat tight. "We do." She walked to the couch and sank down with a soft sigh. I followed her, taking a seat opposite her and keeping a deliberate distance between us. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. I had no idea how to begin or what I could say to make this situation any less complicated. "I know things have changed," she started, clasping her hands together in her lap. "And I don't want you to feel uneasy. That's the last thing I want." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "I don't even know how I'm supposed to feel," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "This isn't normal, is it? We're not supposed to feel like this." Jessica looked down at her hands, her face clouded with worry. "I know," she said softly, "but it's not something we can just ignore, can we?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I was just as lost as she was. Everything about this felt wrong, but at the same time, there was a part of me that didn't want it to end. I couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it, but the emotions were undeniable. She shifted her position, leaning forward slightly. "I think about that night constantly," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Her words made my breath catch. I wanted to tell her I thought about it too, that it was on my mind every moment of the day, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I simply nodded, my heart racing in my chest. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything neither of us could say aloud. The tension was building again, the same magnetic pull that had brought us to this point. Before I realized it, I spoke. "I think about it too." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and once they were said, there was no taking them back. Jessica's eyes lifted to meet mine, and I knew in that instant that there was no retreating from this. We had crossed a line, and now we were teetering on the edge of something even riskier. At first she didn't reply, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. There was a fire there, a longing that mirrored my own. It terrified me, but at the same time it thrilled me in a way I couldn't deny. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice unsteady. But even as I spoke, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "I know," she whispered, her gaze unwavering. "But we're already here, aren't we?" The room felt too small, the air too heavy. I wanted to get up, to leave, to create as much space as possible between us. But I couldn't move. I wasn't trapped by her. I was trapped by my own desires. The pull between us was too strong, too overpowering to fight. Before I could process what was happening, she leaned in closer, her face mere inches from mine. I could feel her warm breath on my skin, soft and tantalizing. For a fleeting moment, I thought I might be able to stop it, to pull away before it went too far. But then her lips met mine, and all rational thought disappeared. This time, the kiss wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was charged with all the tension and yearning we'd been suppressing. Without thinking, I kissed her back, my hands gripping the couch for balance, as though grounding myself could keep the moment from spiraling further. It wasn't about love or affection. It was pure need, raw and overpowering, something neither of us could control. My heart pounded as my thoughts spun wildly, impossible to organize. All I knew was that there was no turning back now. When we finally parted, both of us were breathing hard, our foreheads resting against one another. The weight of what we had just done was suffocating, yet neither of us moved to break the moment. "We have to stop," I said again, but the weakness in my voice betrayed me. Jessica nodded slightly, her breath brushing against my skin. "I know," she murmured. "But it's so hard, isn't it?" I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. We were caught in this web of our own making, and no matter how much we told ourselves we needed to stop, the force pulling us together was too strong to resist. Then it happened again. She leaned in and neither of us could fight it. It all unfolded so quickly, and though the intensity overwhelmed me, she seemed completely at ease. When it was over, she smiled, her expression telling me just how much she had enjoyed it. The following days blurred together. We tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every time I saw her, I felt the same surge of heat, the same dangerous connection. It was like we were orbiting one another, waiting for the inevitable moment when we would give in again. I knew it was only a matter of time. One evening, while my dad was working late, I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to distract my mind by preparing dinner. But the silence in the house was oppressive, every little sound echoing like a reminder of the situation I couldn't escape. I didn't hear her enter at first. When I turned around, there she was, leaning against the doorframe, watching me with that same enigmatic expression. "Need any help?" she asked, her tone light. But there was something hidden beneath her words that made my heart race. "No, I'm fine," I replied, though my trembling hands betrayed me. Jessica stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, the space between us shrinking to almost nothing. "Are you sure?" she asked softly, her gaze fixed on mine. I swallowed hard, trying to regain control. "Jessica, we can't," I began, but she interrupted before I could continue. "We don't have to do anything," she murmured, her voice calm yet firm. "But I think we both know where this is heading." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew she was right. Silence enveloped us, the tension between us growing unbearable. And then, before I realized what was happening, she kissed me again. It was brief, almost fleeting, but it reignited the feelings we'd been struggling to suppress. My heart thundered in my chest, and I knew this was far from the end. The following weeks blurred into a haze of stolen moments and subtle glances. It felt like living two separate lives, one where everything appeared normal, and another where Jessica and I teetered on the edge of something we couldn't control. The weight of our secret pressed down on us, yet no matter how often I told myself it had to stop, we couldn't. Every time my dad left for work or stayed out late, the tension grew. We would find ourselves in the same room, and without a word, we both knew what was coming. It scared me how easily we had fallen into this pattern. Each touch, each look, felt like crossing an invisible boundary, yet it never stopped us. Instead, it drew us closer together, as though something beyond our understanding was leading us down this path. One Saturday afternoon, the atmosphere in the house felt heavier than usual. My dad was attending a work event and wouldn't be home until late. From the moment I woke up, I felt the familiar anticipation that had become so common. As the hours passed, the feeling grew stronger, as though something irreversible was about to happen. Jessica was in the kitchen when I walked in, her back turned as she washed dishes. She didn't react to my entrance, though I knew she was aware I was there. I paused by the doorway, watching her for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. This strange dance we'd been caught in had become second nature, and I knew the steps all too well. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands on a towel, and faced me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, heavy with unspoken words. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her eyes searching mine. I wasn't. I hadn't been for a long time. But how could I admit that? How could I put into words the internal conflict tearing me apart? "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely audible. Jessica stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "I've been thinking," she began, her tone careful and deliberate. "Maybe we should talk about what's been happening." I tensed, unsure if I was ready for this conversation. What was there to say that hadn't already been conveyed through our actions? But I knew she wouldn't let it go, and I couldn't avoid it forever. "What's there to talk about?" I asked, my pulse racing. She sighed, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe we need to figure out where this is going. We can't keep pretending it's not happening." She was right, but I didn't want to hear it. "Where do you think it's going?" I shot back, my tone sharper than intended. Jessica flinched but held my gaze. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But we can't keep tiptoeing around it." Frustration bubbled inside me, and I ran a hand through my hair. "What do you want from me?" I snapped, not out of anger at her, but because I didn't have the answers either. "Do you want me to say this is fine? That I'm okay with it? Because I'm not. I'm not okay with any of this." Her expression softened, and she closed the distance between us. "I don't want you to be okay with it," she said softly. "I just want you to be honest. With yourself and with me." Her words hit me hard, like a blow I wasn't prepared for. She was right. I'd been lying to myself, convincing myself this was temporary, that it would end if we ignored it. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't stop wanting her, and the more I tried to resist, the stronger those feelings became. I don't know how to do that, I admitted, my voice breaking. I don't know how to be honest about this. Jessica reached out, her hand resting gently on my arm. Her touch sent a shiver through me, and I hated how much I craved it. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice full of understanding. "We'll figure it out together." Her sincerity broke something inside me. Before I realized it, I was pulling her closer, kissing her as though it was the only thing keeping me grounded. This time, the kiss wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow and deliberate, as though we were both trying to hold on to something slipping away. When we finally parted, our foreheads rested together, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel her heartbeat racing, matching my own. "What are we doing?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. "I don't know," she replied softly, "but I can't stop." Neither could I. As the days passed, we sank deeper into whatever this was. Our moments together grew more intense, more frequent, until it felt like the only time I was truly myself was when I was with her. I knew it couldn't last. Something had to give eventually, but I wasn't ready to face that yet. And then one evening, it all came crashing down. I was sitting in the living room with the TV on, though the sound was muted, my thoughts miles away. Jessica was upstairs, and my dad was supposed to be out late again. I wasn't keeping track of the time, too consumed by the whirlwind of thoughts about everything we'd done and the irreversible nature of it all. The sound of the front door opening jolted me back to the present, and for a moment I froze, panic washing over me. I hadn't expected my dad to come home so soon. I scrambled to stand, but before I could do anything, he was already walking into the living room, his eyes sweeping the space until they landed on me. "Hey," he said, his tone casual, though there was an undertone I couldn't quite place. "What are you up to?" "Just watching TV," I replied, my voice strained as I struggled to keep my panic from surfacing. My heart was pounding, and the guilt was gnawing at me like a raw nerve. If he noticed, he didn't let on, or maybe he saw it and chose to ignore it. He sat down on the couch and started flipping through the channels, acting as if it were any other normal evening. I tried to steady myself, convincing myself that everything was fine, but the weight of what we were concealing felt suffocating. A few minutes later, Jessica came down the stairs, her expression carefully composed. She greeted my dad as though nothing was wrong, like everything was perfectly normal. But I caught the tension in her eyes and the nervous way her hands fidgeted at her sides. Dinner that night was agonizing. The conversation was forced, and every word from my dad made me feel like the walls were closing in. I avoided Jessica's gaze, unable to focus on anything other than the knot of dread tightening in my chest. I hoped we could get through the evening without incident, that somehow we could maintain the facade for just one more night. But as we were clearing the table, my dad turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending a lot of time with Jessica lately," he said, his tone calm but probing. My heart stopped. I glanced at Jessica, whose face had gone pale, her eyes wide with alarm. I guess," I stammered, struggling to keep my voice even. His gaze lingered on me for what felt like an eternity, and I sensed a shift in the air around us. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" he asked, his voice still casual, but there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. My mind raced, frantically searching for anything that could explain it all, anything that could make this go away. But I couldn't find the words. I couldn't lie, not when the truth was hovering so close, unspoken but palpable. Jessica's hand brushed against mine under the table. A silent plea, but it only deepened my guilt. "No," I whispered at last, my voice barely audible. "Nothing." My dad didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable, his silence stretching on. In that moment, I knew he knew. The weight of his gaze bore down on me, and I realized there was no escaping what had already begun. Even though the words remained unspoken, the truth lingered in the air, undeniable. And I knew it would follow me, no matter how desperately I tried to run from it.